Hello and welcome to StrangePlay. My name is Rick and this is my review of the Shenmue collection on the PlayStation 4. Now, before I begin, I need to do a small disclaimer. Between 2012 and 2017, I worked for SEGA Europe. This is why, up until November 2017, I never covered SEGA news or played SEGA games on the channel. I bring this up now because, although I left the company close to a year ago, my name does appear in the credits of these games. Now, games credits are usually one of the first things submitted to a project, and is usually just a list of people working for the company at the time. I had absolutely nothing to do with the development or marketing of these games, and the announcement was just as big a surprise to me as it was to you guys. So with that being said, let's get on with the review. First released on Sega's Dreamcast in 1999, Shenmue was produced and directed by Yu Suzuki, the creator of Hang On, Space Harrier, Outrun, and Virtua Fighter, to name a few. In fact, Shenmue began life as a Virtua Fighter spin-off. It was to be an action RPG starring Virtua Fighter poster child Akira Yuki, but as development continued, the Virtua Fighter name was dropped and Shenmue became its own beast. Now, I was a late adopter to the Dreamcast, and by that point the game was hard to come by for an acceptable price, so I never got to play Shenmue when it was originally released. However, the name and love for the game was hard to avoid. Shenmue is often mentioned in greatest game of all time conversations, and it's often heralded for being the game that created QuickTime events as we know them today. In fact, it was series creator Yu Suzuki who coined the phrase. It's been over 19 years since the original game's release, and since then it's become legendary. Just as notorious for its repetitive dialogue and terrible voice acting as for all of its, at the time, groundbreaking achievements. In Shenmue, you play as Ro Hazuki, a teenage boy who sees his father killed before him, murdered by a man named Lon D after giving up possession of an ancient mirror. 4 days after his father's murder, Ro begins to explore the town of Dobuito in Yasuka, talking to the people who live there while trying to find clues that will hopefully lead him to finding his father's killer. The more that gets revealed, the more danger Ro finds himself in, until he finally gets a job at a dock and spends the final third of the game working as a forklift driver. There's a little more to it than that, but not much. It's your basic revenge plot, complete with all your favourite twists, turns and tropes that usually come along with this kind of story. It plays out like a soap opera, complete with hammy acting and bad dialogue, and for the most part, I enjoyed it. Speaking to the townsfolk and learning about Dobuito was a lot of fun. Whenever the plot progressed, there were some genuinely tense and exciting moments. It ends on a cliffhanger, and I'm grateful I didn't have to wait years for the story to continue. The story of Shenmue 2 picks up almost immediately after the first game, and takes place in both Hong Kong and Kowloon, and sees Ro continuing his journey of vengeance, while he is forced to put aside his pride to learn about the voodoo and make friends in low places. He's still rude as shit to people, but there's some genuine character development here which I thought was severely lacking in the first game. The jump between Shenmue and its sequel is unreal. Not only have the graphics and lighting improved significantly, whereas Shenmue had 5 decent sized areas to explore, Shenmue 2 feels like it has around 10 times that. Whereas the areas in Shenmue were small and drab, with only a small selection of locals to talk to, perfectly encapsulating the feel of a small Japanese town, the areas in Shenmue 2 are huge, vibrant and bustling with all manner of people. The voice acting in Shenmue is as bad as you've heard. A quick look at the game's IMDb page will show you that the voice actors in Shenmue did very little before and after, and it's easy to see why. As bad as it is, however, it gives Shenmue a certain charm, like an old badly dubbed kung fu movie. It was more funny than off-putting for me, and there is an option to switch the audio to Japanese, but to be honest the quality isn't that much better. It isn't just the voice acting that's the issue with the VO. There's a weird compression effect on the voice that makes it sound disembodied and distorted. It's the same for the music too. For the most part it's fine, but when it peaks it distorts and sounds terrible. The sound mix in the original Shenmue is just simply awful. However, the sound is greatly improved in Shenmue 2. Characters no longer sound compressed and distorted, and the music is mixed far better. The overall quality of the voice acting has improved too, and Corey Marshall's performance as Ro is significantly better than in the first game. There are still a couple of characters whose voices could be considered problematic in this day and age, sounding more like parodies than genuine accents. But there's nothing in here that comes even close to how offensive Tom sounds in the original Shenmue.
But that man, he gave me this glare. I ain't never seen such a cold stare, man.
I also experienced sound effects cut out several times across both games, mainly during QuickTime events, which was especially jarring. These games also have some of the best and worst music I've ever heard in a game. The main theme is beautiful and haunting, and many of the tracks used in the towns at different times of day create a moving ambience that perfectly sets the tone for both the world we as the player are exploring, as well as Ro's own mindset. And then there's the track Rush to the Harbour, which I can only describe as a synth robot jazz band having a fight in the dark. It's supposed to portray a feeling of urgency and badassery, if that's even a word, but it's just cheesy and terrible. I've heard better music on the Mega Drive. Gameplay is split into 3 different scenarios: investigation, combat and cinematics. When exploring, Rogue controls like a tank, which makes him feel clunky and outdated. The game's description boasts a choice of modern or classic controls, but apart from inverting the Y-axis or changing the weather to how it actually was in that specific region of Japan during December 1986, I can't see an option to do so. It wasn't too much of a problem when exploring open areas, and after spending some time readjusting to the archaic control scheme, it began to feel natural again, but as soon as Ro enters an enclosed space, it becomes a different story. There's also a stealth section in the original Shenmue that is honestly one of the worst stealth sections I've ever played. The clunky controls and bad camera do not fit stealth sections at all, and considering Metal Gear Solid came out a year earlier, there's no excuse for this shitty awful section. When pressing left or right on the analog stick, instead of turning to face that direction, Ro begins to walk in a circle. This can make lining him up to look at objects or people a nightmare. This is especially problematic when trying to look at the many maps littered around the many areas, and you'll be looking at them a lot, as it's the only way to find the names and locations of places you'll need to visit. Shenmue 2 introduces mini-maps for each area which can be bought for 10 Hong Kong dollars each, but they're so basic they're not really worth the purchase. The in-game camera is absolute trash as well. It can be controlled with the right analog stick, but it only moves 180 degrees behind Ro, and as soon as you let go of the stick it moves back behind him again. After spending too much time fighting with this, I just left it alone, and it is possible to get through the game without adjusting the camera yourself. Holding L2 will switch the camera to first person mode, allowing you to read signs and investigate objects. This too feels clunky. The camera will snap onto any object you're trying to look at, often the wrong object, and I constantly found myself fighting with it. It's a nice idea, and it does a good job of creating a real sense of investigation and breaks up the pace a bit, but it would have been better if the camera were free, highlighting objects without locking onto them. However, apart from being used to view the area maps in Shenmue 2, this mechanic is only really used in a couple of big sections during each game, so it's not as bad as it could have been. By far one of the biggest issues I have with Shenmue is the waiting times. The people in the world of Shenmue go about their daily lives, and more than once Roy would have to be at a certain place at a certain time to speak to a specific person. It doesn't sound too bad, but there's no option to fast forward, so I'd often find myself standing in front of a storefront for several hours waiting for a shop to open or a resident to arrive. The worst offender for this was a quest chain where after waking up at 8 AM I had to wait until 2 PM for the tattoo shop to open, only to be told to meet somebody else at 3 PM the following day at a different destination. I'm just glad we're playing this in an era where we can browse the internet or play games on our mobile phones while we wait for the game to allow us to continue, but this should never be the case with a game. I'd often find myself playing on my PlayStation Vita during these sections of downtime, but the fact that I need to keep myself entertained while playing Shenmue by playing a completely different game is simply terrible game design. Luckily, if a mobile phone or a different game is out of the question for you, there are a ton of things to do in the game during these long waiting periods. You can go to the arcade and play full arcade ports of Hang On and Space Harrier, have a game of darts, or test your reaction times with a pair of QuickTime event games. The ports of Hang On and Space Harrier are superb. They're sharp and responsive and as difficult as ever. Hang On is an absolute dream to play, and I spent more time on there than I care to admit. I'm not very good at Space Harrier, so I only played a couple of times. But the final time I played it, it bugged out on me and wouldn't let me exit the game. I had to reset the game and lost a full day of in-game progress. There's also a weird bug with the QTE machine, where pressing up when prompted doesn't register, causing you to fail automatically. I've looked into this issue online, and I'm not the only one experiencing it. Like many of the game's issues, this needs to be patched out and quick. There are also gacha machines scattered throughout the region with numerous toys to collect inside, slot machines to gamble your money away, music cassettes containing the soundtrack to find, and a number of scrolls that can teach Ro new combat techniques. But I never figured out how to use them as they're written in Chinese, and whenever I went to see the woman who translated something for me during the story in hopes she'd help me translate these scrolls, she'd just tell me about her grandson. Thankfully, the huge chunks of dead time are improved significantly in Shenmue 2 with the introduction of a wait feature. Whenever Ro has to wait for significant periods of time, an option to wait on the spot appears, and once selected, the game will skip to the desired time. This made Shenmue 2 much more enjoyable for me, as it kept the story moving forward at a good pace, and doesn't make the player feel like they're being punished for trying to play the game. Most of the collectibles and minigames from Shenmue return in Shenmue 2, only with arcade ports of Outrun and Afterburner instead of Hang On, and the scrolls that teach Ro new combat techniques can now be used straight from the item menu like an item. The combat in Shenmue is a dressed down version of that found in the Virtua Fighter series, with Ro able to kick, punch, block and evade in a 3D space. It's a nice idea, but one that doesn't really work for me in the original. Virtua Fighter is probably my least played fighting game series. It always felt awkward and clunky to me, and I was never willing to put in the time to get good, which put me at a disadvantage when playing Shenmue. Fights are manageable when it's one-on-one, but when the game pits Ro against multiple opponents, combat feels clumsy, awkward, and for me, frustrating. Because of the lack of fights in the game, there's never any real opportunity to practice and get good at the combat. You can shadowbox in the dojo, but that doesn't really help. Apparently, you can train with Fukusan, there's even a trophy for it, but outside of the mandatory fight you have with him, whenever I spoke to him, no option to spar ever appeared. Combat is significantly improved in Shenmue 2. Ro feels quicker and more responsive, and the enemies now have a visible health meter, making it possible to gauge a fight and decide if you should be offensive or defensive. I was grateful for these improvements, as there is significantly more combat in Shenmue 2 than in the first game, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. Encounters in the first game usually take the form of QuickTime events, and although I'm not a fan of the combat in the first game, the QTEs were an even bigger problem for me. The mechanic that Shenmue helped revolutionise upon its original release is now one of its biggest flaws. Even though the button prompts have been changed from the Dreamcast to that of the new respective console, it doesn't appear that the response times have been adjusted to compensate for input latency often experienced with modern televisions. This makes many QTE sections a case of trial and error. I often found myself replaying the same section over and over again, trying to memorise the button sequence so I could preemptively press them before the icons appeared on screen. This problem is even worse in Shenmue 2, as there are considerably more QuickTime event sections in the game, and the inclusion of a new Simon Says style QuickTime event, where the game will flash up a sequence of several commands and the player has only a short period of time to input them. Maybe it's the input lag, or maybe my reflexes have slowed down as I've gotten older, I couldn't say for sure. All I know is the QuickTime events in these games are really fucking bad. As far as ports go, the Shenmue collection isn't the best. Thanks to some terrible reporting on the part of news sites, I was expecting an HD or remastered collection, and this certainly is not that, and sadly we live in a time where HD textures and widescreen aspect ratio just isn't enough. We just have to look at publishers like Square Enix and the quality of their remasters of Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy XII, or Toys for Bob in their Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy, and their soon-to-be-released Spyro the Dragon Reignited trilogy. We can look at publishers like Capcom and the Devil May Cry remasters and Resident Evil remakes for an example of how to modernise old classics. And we can even look at Sega themselves and the phenomenal work they've done on remaking the original Yakuza games with the Kiwami titles. When looking at it this way, the Shenmue collection just feels like a lazy port, a quick attempt at cashing in on the hype of Shenmue 3. A true remaster would have fixed things like the dodgy controls and the terrible sound mix. It could have updated the combat system to mimic a Virtua Fighter title that isn't 20 years old, and added the ability to fast forward through those painfully long waiting times. It's also littered with more bugs than I can count, and although a patch was released a few days ago that fixed some of them, I can't comment on improvements, if any, as I finished both of these games pre-patch. So, do I recommend this collection? Honestly, yes, but with some caveats. If you already hate the Shenmue games, then this collection will not change your mind. In fact, unresponsive QTEs and the absolute mountain of bugs littering the game will probably make you hate them even more. Similarly, if you already own the original games, a Dreamcast and a CRT TV, then you have no reason to pick up this collection. The added widescreen only applies to gameplay and cuts back to a 4:3 ratio during cutscenes. So save your money and play the games the way they were meant to be played, and you'll get the most out of them. However, if you love this series and want the convenience of playing them on your HD TV in a 16:9 ratio and don't mind the bugs, then yes, you should buy this collection. Similarly, if you've never played the original games before, but know what they are and what to expect, and want to experience this slice of gaming history for yourself, much like I did, then yes, this is definitely worth your time. Despite its many issues, at its core, Shenmue is a good game full of moments and mechanics that have shaped games for 2 decades since its release. And even though it hasn't aged as well as other games from that era, there's no taking away what it has given to gaming as a whole. These are flawed classics, but ones that I feel deserve to be experienced again. And for less than £30, you can do a lot worse. Maybe just play it safe and wait for another couple of patches to be released. But that's it for this review of Shenmue 1 and 2 on PS4. Do you agree? Disagree? Have you played it yourself? Let me know in the comments below, or talk to us over at Twitter at StrangePlay UK, or join our Facebook group at facebook.com/StrangePlay UK. You can also join our Discord server. You can find the invite link in the description. Also, if you like this video or like what we do on the channel, feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. It helps us grow and we really appreciate it. And with that out of the way, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time.